When the palace halls fell silent after Queen Elizabeth's passing, few expected that 4 tiny creatures would ignite the monarchy's most unexpected storm. Aides hushed their voices, but the whispers travelled fast. The Queen's beloved Corgis were not to be scattered or sent to family. They had one exclusive recipient, and it wasn't Camilla, Catherine, or Anne. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. In the cold, echoing aftermath of the Queen's funeral, Windsor Castle was a kingdom paused in time. The courtiers moved with deliberate caution, their every step shadowed by a tension that refused to lift. Whispers danced between corridors, rumours cloaked in uncertainty. No one dared speak it aloud, but the question loomed in every glance exchanged behind the palace curtains. What would become of the Queen's most cherished companions? Her Corgis, loyal until the final breath, had been more than pets. They were extensions of her identity, symbols of continuity, comfort, and something deeply personal. Yet as days passed, no formal announcement emerged. The dogs remained unseen, their fate unspoken. This delay didn't go unnoticed. Within the walls of Buckingham and Sandringham alike, silence morphed into speculation. Was there a dispute? Had a decision been made and deliberately withheld? Then, without warning, an unconfirmed report slipped into the hands of a curious tabloid journalist, an alleged leak from a palace aide who claimed the Queen had left specific handwritten instructions regarding the guardianship of the dogs. Not a committee decision, not left to the King's discretion. A personal wish sealed before her passing. What rattled insiders wasn't just that such a note existed, but whose name it contained: Duchess Sophie. The name reverberated through palace walls with the impact of a falling chandelier. Not Camilla, the Queen consort. Not Princess Anne, the stalwart daughter. Not even Catherine, the media-adored future Queen. But Sophie, Countess of Wessex, the royal who often walked in quiet shadows while others chased spotlights. The very notion seemed almost inconceivable to some, and yet increasingly inevitable to those who truly understood the Queen's guarded sentiments. Aides scrambled behind the scenes, desperate to verify the report. What they found left them breathless. Hidden behind a framed photograph of the Queen and Prince Philip at Balmoral, an envelope marked only with a single line for their comfort: "Let them go where they know peace." Inside was a letter, hand-penned in unmistakable script, naming Sophie not in passing but deliberately, with love and purpose. No one could quite explain why the Queen hadn't spoken it aloud in her final days. Perhaps she knew the fallout it would trigger. Perhaps she believed that some choices carried more weight when revealed after silence. But the effect was seismic. The Queen's final will wasn't just about logistics. It was a whisper from beyond the grave. A coded message, one that suggested the dog's future was as symbolic as any crown jewel. And as the palace scrambled to align itself with this truth, another storm was quietly gathering. Because while officials worked to honor the Queen's secret wish, the woman at the heart of it all remained unaware of the responsibility and the legacy about to be placed at her feet. But while the palace scrambled behind the scenes, Sophie was oblivious to the decision that would tether her to the Queen's most sacred companions. While many rushed to the cameras and crowds, Sophie moved in silence, ever loyal, ever steadfast. But was that quiet devotion what moved the Queen to entrust her Corgis not to a daughter or heir, but to the Countess of Wessex? In the turbulent years that reshaped the monarchy from within, Sophie was a constant in the Queen's private world. While headlines were dominated by royal scandals, abdications and shifting titles, Sophie slipped in and out of Balmoral and Windsor like a gentle breeze, always present, never loud. Behind closed doors, their bond deepened far beyond public perception. It wasn't born of obligation or protocol, but of mutual understanding. The Queen, weary from the noise of public life, had often found solace in Sophie's presence. No pretense, no agenda, just 2 women, bound by duty yet yearning for quiet corners where vulnerability could exist. Those visits, never photographed, never leaked, carried a weight no royal appointment could match. Rare glimpses of their closeness did emerge over the years, barely noticed by the wider public. Moments captured unintentionally, Sophie walking a step behind the Queen, while 2 Corgis trotted between them. No security, no fanfare, just companionship. These fragments, scattered across archival footage, only now begin to make sense in retrospect. But perhaps the most telling moment came during one of the Queen's darkest chapters preparing for Prince Philip's funeral. While others busied themselves with ceremony and optics, Sophie remained by her side. When the Queen wept privately in a Windsor sitting room, it was Sophie who placed a steady hand on her shoulder and whispered words no one else dared say. That memory never left Elizabeth. It was a gesture made not in duty but in shared grief. It became increasingly clear that the Queen, despite the formal hierarchy surrounding her, placed an uncommon trust in Sophie. More than Camilla, whose place within the royal machinery was still viewed through a political lens. More than Anne, whose sense of duty was fierce but often inflexible. And even more than Catherine, whose public image was being carefully sculpted for a future throne. Sophie's devotion was never about optics. It was quiet, consistent, and deeply personal. For a monarch who had spent decades deciphering sincerity from strategy, Sophie's presence rang truer than any title. And in that truth, the Corgis became more than dogs. They were her emotional barometers, creatures who sensed her moods, comforted her in solitude, and reminded her of simpler moments before thrones and turmoil. To entrust them was not merely an act of logistical planning. It was a spiritual bequest. She chose not someone who had climbed the ladder of public adoration, but someone who had knelt beside her in silence. Someone who understood the invisible burden of royalty, not because she wore it proudly, but because she carried it quietly. But not everyone welcomed the decision, and as news reached royal ears, palace walls bristled with rivalry. The Queen Consort expected everything: the jewels, the status, even the ceremonies. But when the news reached her that the late Queen's most beloved creatures had been assigned to Sophie, her reaction behind closed doors was anything but regal. Camilla had endured years of resistance before being accepted as the Queen Consort. She had worn the crown, attended state banquets, and stood at Charles's side through public storms. But nothing prepared her for the sting of what seemed like a final, piercing rejection from a woman who had finally embraced her, only to deny her one of the most personal symbols of royal affection: the Corgis. Not titles, not lands, just 4 aging dogs who had shared the Queen's quietest, most vulnerable hours. And now they had been willed not to her, the current Queen, but to Sophie. Camilla's fury, though unseen by the cameras, shook the palace. Behind closed doors, aides recall the clash vividly. Raised voices in the king's private study, Camilla confronting Charles with trembling anger, demanding why she had been passed over. She didn't demand the dogs, but questioned what the Queen's gesture truly meant. Was it deliberate? Was it personal? Had she, even after all these years, still not earned full trust? Charles, blindsided himself, could offer no defense. The Queen's instructions had been explicit, her writing unmistakable. No ambiguity, no room for reinterpretation. It was Sophie, and only Sophie. The tension between the two women, long buried beneath civility and protocol, resurfaced like a long-dormant fault line. Old resentments bled through the smiles. Sophie had always played her role with quiet dignity, never competing, never confronting. But perhaps that was precisely what stung the most. Camilla had fought tooth and nail to be seen, to be accepted. Sophie had simply been trusted. It wasn't about hierarchy, it was about heart. And the Queen had made her final judgment not in words, but in the silent company of the creatures she cherished most. Charles attempted to calm the storm, but even he couldn't deny the intimacy of the Queen's decision. These were not ceremonial Corgis. They were companions who slept by her bed, followed her through corridors, and sat by her feet in moments of solitude. The Queen had always been selective with emotion. To grant the dogs to Sophie was to grant access to her emotional legacy. Camilla was not just overlooked, she was, in her eyes, humiliated. The palace could spin stories for the press, but behind the scenes the sting remained, a symbolic wound that no title could salve. And while Camilla fumed behind palace doors, the woman at the center of it all was about to be hit with the truth. She sat by the window, unaware of the storm building around her. When the aide placed the Queen's handwritten note in her trembling hands, time froze. The final line said everything. "They are happiest in your company." The days following the Queen's funeral had been a blur for Sophie, wrapped in grief, wrapped in silence. She had chosen to stay away from the headlines, from the royal reshuffling, from the internal maneuverings that always followed a monarch's death. Her mourning was private, her movements quiet. As the public speculated, and palace aides scrambled behind closed doors, Sophie simply waited, until the moment came. The envelope had no fanfare, just weight. It bore the Queen's seal and a sense of finality that Sophie could feel before she even touched the paper inside. The handwriting was unmistakable, and so was the message. The Queen hadn't merely left instructions, she had left a piece of herself. The words were few, but they broke something open in Sophie. It wasn't just that she had been chosen, it was how she had been seen, that in the Queen's final private thoughts, she had entrusted the Corgis, those most faithful witnesses to the sovereign's solitude, not to a daughter or a consort, but to the one who had stood in her quietest hours without asking for anything in return. As Sophie read the note again, her breath caught on the last sentence. "They are happiest in your company." The room around her disappeared, and in its place came a memory, one she hadn't spoken of, one that had lived quietly in her heart. It was during one of her last visits to Windsor. The Queen, more frail than usual, sat in her armchair with a blanket over her knees. The Corgis, restless that day, had been circling and whining. Sophie had knelt to the floor, took a biscuit from the Queen's tea tray, and began feeding them one by one. It calmed them. It calmed her. And in that moment, the Queen had looked at her not as a duchess, not as a daughter-in-law, but as a woman who understood. No words were exchanged. None were needed. It was that silent acknowledgement that now rang louder than any royal decree. When the Corgis were finally brought to her, there was a stillness in the air, as if they too understood something profound had changed. Their tails wagged, not in excitement, but in recognition. They moved toward her without hesitation, nuzzled against her legs and nestled beside her feet as if they had simply returned home. Sophie, still holding the letter in her lap, couldn't speak. Her eyes welled, not from the weight of duty, but from the overwhelming realization that she had been part of something deeply sacred. A trust passed not by crown, but by companionship. Her voice broke when she whispered, "Why me?" A question not born of pride, but humility, one that echoed into the halls of Windsor and beyond, stirring emotions that even the firmest royals would struggle to suppress. But the Queen's decision wasn't just emotional. It had hidden implications the royal family couldn't ignore. Many thought the Queen's reign ended with her final breath, but a closer look at her final wishes suggests she left behind one last act of quiet defiance. Assigning the Corgis to Sophie wasn't just sentimental, it was strategic. What seemed at first glance to be a tender, personal gesture, a tribute to a loyal daughter-in-law, began to unravel into something far more deliberate. Within days of Sophie receiving the Corgis, royal analysts and insiders began to notice patterns that suggested this wasn't merely about affection. It was about intention. In bypassing the more traditional figures, Camilla, the Queen Consort, and Catherine, the Princess of Wales Elizabeth, had subtly drawn a line, challenging the assumptions of legacy and optics. This wasn't about titles or hierarchy. It was about trust, temperament, and silent symbolism. To choose Sophie was to make a statement, one that contradicted the inner machinery of the monarchy. The Corgis were not just pets. They were deeply woven into the narrative of the Queen's reign. From wartime broadcasts to Platinum Jubilee appearances, they were a living emblem of stability. They walked beside her through national tragedy, personal grief, and political transformation. They stood for continuity in a world constantly changing. To gift them was to bestow a royal seal without the ceremony, an invisible crown passed in private. And now, they followed Sophie with the same obedience they once reserved only for the Queen, responding to familiar cues as though they instinctively knew who held their late mistress's spirit. That instinct seemed to reflect something deeper, Sophie had never pursued public power. She had never competed for attention, never courted the press. But it was that very humility, quiet, unassuming and unwavering, that set her apart. While others around the Queen had become increasingly entangled in political maneuvering and image-making, Sophie had remained consistent, reliable, human. And the Queen, it seemed, had noticed. In fragments of her diary revealed posthumously to select aides, there were hints of growing fatigue, mentions of the noise, the ambitions, and those who speak too much yet say too little. There, between the lines, was a message. She longed for sincerity over ceremony, and so, by entrusting her Corgis to Sophie, the Queen had sent a message the monarchy couldn't ignore. It wasn't about breaking rules, it was about bending them toward truth. In an institution ruled by spectacle, Elizabeth had chosen symbolism over speeches. The monarchy, after all, has always been shaped more by gestures than declarations. And this one? It spoke louder than any proclamation. The sovereign had not just passed. She had left behind a blueprint, a quiet rebellion cloaked in loyalty and fur. As headlines broke and tabloids spun tales, public opinion shifted, placing Sophie in a light few had ever expected. In the court of public opinion, Sophie rose like a phoenix. With the Corgis by her side, she wasn't just seen as a duchess, she became a symbol of everything the monarchy was desperate to reclaim: warmth, authenticity, and trust. The first photograph struck like lightning across the media landscape. Sophie, dressed simply, walking the Queen's Corgis along the winding path outside Bagshot Park. There was no pomp, no staff in tow, no forced smile. Just her and the dogs, who moved beside her with calm familiarity. That image alone triggered a wave of public fascination. Suddenly, the woman who had often lived in the shadow of louder royals was front and center. Headlines praised her poise. Commentators drew attention to her understated grace. And across social media, a narrative caught fire. Sophie wasn't just walking the Queen's dogs, she was walking in the Queen's footsteps. Almost overnight, Sophie became the face of something that had long eluded the monarchy: unfiltered humanity. Letters poured in from members of the public who had crossed paths with her over the years, stories of quiet acts of kindness, gentle conversations, and her consistent willingness to listen. One tale from a children's hospice staffer recalled how Sophie had visited without photographers, sat for hours, and even cleaned dishes afterward without fanfare. Now, with the Corgis at her side, those stories no longer seemed isolated. They painted a portrait of a woman whose humility ran deeper than duty. The comparisons became inevitable. Camilla, despite her position, was still viewed with skepticism in certain circles, her past never far from public memory. Catherine, though elegant, was seen by some as polished to perfection. But Sophie, she was real. She didn't court affection, which made it all the more genuine when it came. Invitations began pouring in from across the Commonwealth for her to appear at events, particularly those with children or animal charities. She attended a park unveiling with the Corgis, an event meant to honor the Queen's environmental initiatives. Crowds cheered, children ran to pet the dogs, and Sophie simply knelt and smiled, as if this sudden spotlight hadn't shifted her center at all. The emotional resonance deepened when a longtime palace staffer gave an anonymous interview, admitting the dogs were calmer with her, almost relieved. It was like they knew they were safe again. That single quote exploded across the internet, paired with clips of Sophie and the Corgis. The narrative was no longer about who the Queen had chosen, it was about why. And in that understanding, Sophie found herself elevated not by power or protocol, but by the one thing the monarchy had long struggled to preserve: public love. The hashtag Queen Chose Sophie trended for days, as photos, stories and support swelled across platforms. It wasn't orchestrated, it wasn't manufactured, it was organic. And that perhaps made it all the more threatening. Every rise in the royal family invites resentment, and soon, a quiet campaign began to undermine Sophie's unexpected spotlight. Not everyone welcomed Sophie's growing visibility. In the shadows of Windsor and beyond, whispers of favoritism turned into quiet sabotage. The Queen may have chosen her, but others in the firm were prepared to challenge that legacy. The public had embraced Sophie with unanticipated warmth, but inside the palace, unease grew like a weed behind velvet curtains. It began quietly, anonymously, when tips started flooding the inboxes of royal correspondence. Sources, unnamed and unverified, claimed the Queen's decision had been made in haste, clouded by grief and sentiment. The Corgis, they argued, were never meant to carry such symbolic weight. It was just an emotional lapse, a soft moment from a monarch uncharacteristically vulnerable. But those feeding the narrative weren't random outsiders. They were voices within fragments of the institution trying to twist legacy into error. Behind the scenes, senior aides convened under the guise of damage control. Photo ops were arranged. Images surfaced of Camilla with the remaining royal horses, smiling beside plaques commemorating the Queen's favourite stables. Press releases subtly reminded the public of Camilla's shared love for animals. Royal briefings began to elevate her bond with Elizabeth, though no such stories had dominated headlines during the Queen's life. The timing was too precise, the messaging too coordinated. It wasn't a celebration of the past, it was a quiet rewrite of it. To diminish Sophie's moment, others were being repositioned to reclaim it. Tensions escalated when Charles invited Princess Anne to a private lunch at Highgrove. Those close to the matter reported a serious, almost clinical conversation about the current optics. Anne, long regarded as the family's most dutiful operator, was reportedly blunt. The Queen's choice was final, yes, but the public fixation on Sophie was beginning to eclipse the Mon. Archie's intended messaging. Something had to be rebalanced. Charles, sympathetic to Sophie but burdened by his own image battles, appeared torn. The Queen's decision had blindsided him too. And now he found himself walking the razor's edge between respecting her wishes and protecting the firm's unity. Then came something darker, hate mail. Dozens of anonymous letters and emails directed at Sophie, accusing her of undermining the Queen consort and clinging to sympathy for status. Security staff, once passive protectors, were now actively scanning for threats. The palace refused to acknowledge it publicly, but the tone behind closed doors was shifting. This was no longer just a matter of inheritance, it was a matter of control. The narrative had to be reclaimed. A calculated leak suggested the dogs had been intended for the Queen's granddaughters, and that Sophie had only received them due to last-minute clerical confusion. The claim was baseless, but that was never the point. The aim was to fracture the clarity of the Queen's intent and cloud Sophie's rising light in fog. Sophie, for her part, said nothing. She declined interviews, ignored press questions, and continued her private engagements. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was power, and that only deepened the mystique. Inside the palace, that silence became more threatening than any speech, because in a world obsessed with optics, Sophie had become untouchable. She didn't ask for the crown of public favour, and yet somehow it had landed on her shoulders. But it was an unexpected revelation buried deep in the Queen's personal archives that reignited everything. Inside a locked cabinet, among old collars and hand-sewn blankets, lay something no one expected: a personal letter from the Queen, written in the voice of her Corgis. What it revealed stunned even the most seasoned aides. The discovery was accidental. An archivist, tasked with cataloguing the Queen's private belongings from Windsor, stumbled upon a leather-bound booklet tucked behind a faded tartan cushion. At first it seemed ordinary, just another memento in a lifetime of monarchy. But when they opened the cover, everything changed. The front page, in the Queen's delicate handwriting, bore a title both cryptic and intimate: "To the one who understands them." Inside, the entries were dated sporadically across years, and as the words unfolded, it became clear this was no diary. It was a love letter, a testament, written from the imagined perspective of her beloved Corgis, every line steeped in emotional nuance and aching honesty. It was Elizabeth's most private voice, shielded for decades until now. The entries were simple, yet profound. "We love her scent," one line add, "her laugh, her quiet." These were not just endearing notes, they were layered memories. The Queen described the way Sophie would kneel without hesitation, the way the dogs would break rank and trot to her, tails wagging with a different kind of joy. It wasn't just routine affection, it was instinctual recognition. Over and over, the Queen described moments that had gone unnoticed by the world, how the dogs waited at the door when Sophie visited, how they would sit beside her unprompted, how once they refused to eat until Sophie arrived. These were not recollections made for history. They were messages left for truth. But it was the final entry that shook the palace to its core, a single paragraph, scrawled just months before the Queen's passing. In it, Elizabeth wrote as if the Corgis themselves were speaking, "She is the one who sees us, not as ornaments, but as lives. When she walks in, we follow. When she leaves, we wait. We wait for her at the door, not for me." That line was a blow to anyone still clinging to the idea that the Queen's choice had been sentimental or spontaneous. It was neither. It was deliberate. And this journal was its undeniable evidence. The document was authenticated, its ink matched and the insignia at the back pressed with the Queen's private seal, used only for her most intimate writings. Senior aides reviewed it in silence, aware of the political aftershocks it would cause if ever leaked. But within those walls, there was no denying it anymore. The Queen had spoken, through the voice of her most cherished companions, and what she left behind wasn't just a directive. It was a confession of loyalty given in the language of love. The monarchy may continue, the titles may shift, but one legacy stood unchallenged. The Queen's last guardians were not just dogs, they were messengers. In a palace built on titles and bloodlines, it was a quiet Duchess and 4 small dogs who carried forward the Queen's truest essence. And in the echo of royal footsteps, one truth remains. Loyalty cannot be crowned, it must be earned. Sophie never sought the spotlight. Even as the Corgis trotted faithfully by her side, she remained unchanged, refusing to exploit the moment for influence or praise. She didn't grant interviews, didn't posture for approval. Her gestures remained simple, sincere, rooted in reverence, not recognition. And the public noticed. Time and again she was seen not parading but remembering, her focus never wavering from the spirit of the woman whose legacy she now quietly upheld. One moment captured it all, the Corgis lying peacefully at her feet in the Queen's memorial garden, unmoving, eyes closed, as though they too understood they were home again. It was not staged. It was sacred. Historians began calling it one of the most intimate acts of Elizabeth's legacy, not just the bequeathing of her beloved animals, but the choice of their guardian. In an institution notorious for ceremony, hierarchy, and image, the Queen had broken the mold with her final wish. She had looked beyond the expected, past the palatial charts of seniority, and handed her trust to the one person who had never asked for it. That choice, quiet, personal, and unpublicized, spoke louder than any royal decree. And as the months passed, so did public sentiment shift with it. Letters of support turned into petitions. There were whispers of giving Sophie a larger platform within the firm, not as a calculated move, but as a reflection of earned trust. Meanwhile, Camilla remained silent. Her absence from future Corgi-related appearances was subtle but telling. Invitations were politely declined. Remarks went unmade. In corridors where she had once tried to position herself as the Queen's emotional heir, the void left behind was now filled not by power, but by presence. Sophie's presence. The shift wasn't announced, it simply settled into the royal landscape like morning mist. It became understood, and then came the final moment, the one that would quietly etch itself into memory. On a quiet day, Sophie was seen walking down a fog-covered path, the 4 Corgis moving behind her in slow, synchronized silence. She didn't wave, didn't speak, she didn't need to. Her walk was steady, her head bowed slightly, as if carrying the weight of memory, not fame. There were no medals, no titles, no coronets. But she had something rare, undeniable dignity, and that, in the end, was the Queen's final lesson. That sometimes the most meaningful legacy isn't left in speeches or statues, but in the footsteps of those who choose love over status, service over ceremony. Because sometimes the greatest crown isn't worn on the head, it walks faithfully beside you. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.